Right, well, hello everybody, welcome to Drydock episode 58, first Drydock of the month, therefore Patreon Q&A through the entire Drydock. Just a couple of bits of channel admin. First is, sorry for those of you a little bit late to the notice, but the medals are all gone now. The last 6, I think, sold in the past week, and I am in the process of sending them off to their respective new owners. I will try and bring some other stuff over to the Etsy site based on feedback and suggestions in various videos. The next thing I'm looking on putting together is possibly some form of anti-submarine periscope hammer set, because that seemed to cause quite a lot of laughs in the anti-submarine warfare, submarine development in World War One, etc. video. But yes, if there's sort of small, curious things like that that you think would be appropriate given the content of previous videos, again, please feel free to mention them below in the comments. Only other two issues are one small technical issue, which is those of you who've been listening to the Drydock on SoundCloud for the past few months have probably realised that there haven't been any Drydocks on SoundCloud for the past few weeks. This isn't because I've stopped uploading to it, there seems to be some form of technical issue with SoundCloud. I have asked them to try and help me out with it, but basically what's happening is I go to upload a file, it sits there, it uploads, it processes, it says 100% fine, done, and then vanishes off the face of the planet. So we shall see how that's resolved. If at this point, if by the time you're listening to this episode has also appeared on SoundCloud, then clearly the issue was resolved, which will be nice. And finally, of course, is just to restate that on the 14th, so Saturday the 14th, so that is the Saturday after this Drydock gets released, I will be at the World of Warships event in Van Helder in the Netherlands, and just in case any of you are wondering, no, I'm not being sponsored by World of Warships to go there, at least not at the moment. I'm not being paid at all for it. I'm paying for this trip out of my own money, and I'm going there effectively for two reasons. One, I want to have a poke around, and it's as good a time as any, and two, I want to see if I can meet up with some of you guys, and it seems to be an appropriate place to do so, considering that Wargaming will probably be giving out free stuff, which is always nice to pick up. So yes, hope to see some of you there, and if you do see me filming, obviously, for whatever reason, feel free to come and talk to me behind the lens at any point. If you do talk to me in front of the lens, there's a very high chance you'll just end up on the channel, so you have been warned. Emerald Leafeon asks, let's say you wake up on December 6th, 1941 in Admiral Kimmel's body. What is the first thing you do? The second, and what actions do you take to ready for the attack only you know is coming? Let me think. First, screaming. Lots and lots of screaming. Second, drink. Lots and lots of drinking. Third, assuming that I'm still in a vaguely fit state to command, I start thinking about what I can do to sort things out. Now, there's a number of problems that I'm facing, basically, with the fact I've got about 24 hours or so to try and make things slightly less terrible. I mean, if I start raving on about how the Japanese are only a few hundred miles away and they're all about to come and try and kill us all, they'll probably put me in the straight form of the white jacket and lock me away, so I'm going to have to play things a little bit more subtly. So first thing I'd probably do is announce a surprise competition which involves unloading all your main magazines. And the first ship that can unload all its main magazines from every class gets, I don't know, a 3-day shore leave pass, if that's still a thing, or was a thing back then. Yeah, just watch the ammunition come flying out at that point. Only main ammunition, though, not your secondaries. So that competition will probably take up a fair bit of time, and hopefully will empty out the magazines of the battleships, which should prevent some of the more disastrous things, like some of the explosions of the destroyers, and more specifically the explosion of the Arizona. That will have gone a long way towards helping save lives. What else would I do? Well, simultaneously with that, I'd have anti-aircraft drills run at the end of the day, and I'd schedule it such and give orders such that they're supposed to prepare the ships for anti-aircraft attack, but run the exercise at such a point that everybody goes off duty right as the exercise concludes, and leave specific orders that everything can be tidied up the next day. So that means all the ship's crews hopefully will have fresh in their mind how to respond to an air assault, and also have all their ammunition there and ready to go, which should lay the groundwork quite nicely. And then lastly, I will probably send a messenger over to the service branch that's in charge of that radar section that actually saw the incoming attack but thought it was a bunch of B-17s. Just completely randomly ask them to inform me the instant they pick up any major formations for, say, the next 24 hours, just out of interest. And so hopefully when that radar station picks up the incoming Japanese attack, then I will be... Oh, and obviously get various ships to light off a couple of boilers to give them some more power. But yeah, so then when the radar station reports, well, Admiral, I've just detected this random large flight of aircraft, and we think it's B-17s or whatever, then on the morning of the 7th, then I will throw my hat into the air and start ranting and raving about how the Japanese are coming to kill us all, and that everybody needs to stand too, because everyone's first response should hopefully be to obey orders and then drag off the kicking and screaming Admiral to see what's gone wrong with him. And by that point the Japanese will have shown up, at which point they'll probably let me go because, hey, he was right. Except this time the Japanese will be walking straight into a fully prepared anti-aircraft barrage, and even if they do start managing to score rather nasty hits, the fact of the matter is, well, if there's no main magazine storage, you can't have a main magazine explosion. I probably also have quietly asked on the Saturday, quietly radioed Enterprise and asked her to make best speed and possibly launch some fighters over to land that just coincidentally will happen to show up around about the right time to run an intercept on the second wave. Realistically, that's probably all I could do without sounding like a complete stark raving lunatic. Bill Cunningham asks, if you could command any losing fleet from any single battle in history, which fleet would you command, and how would you then win the battle? I had to think about this one for quite a while, but I'm going to go with the Battle of Actium, mainly because I like throwing spanners in the works of conventional history, and having Octavian defeated in, possibly killed in battle, and therefore having Mark Antony take the Roman Empire down a completely different line, would be quite the upset. As for how I'd win it, well, first things first, I know that one of Antony's admirals is going to defect, so I would quietly have him stabbed before he can do that. Hence, Octavian doesn't get my battle plan. Second, I would make sure some of my officers are sent over to Cleopatra's squadron, ostensibly as visiting dignitaries, but really to make sure she doesn't just skedaddle, as she did historically. And thirdly, I would make sure that I take command far enough back so that I can at least attempt to find whoever knows the secrets of Greek fire and get that installed on my ships, because that'll be a nice surprise for Octavian's vessels when I can suddenly throw Greek fire at them, or possibly project it if a Greek fire projector is available. But bargaining on the possibility of not being able to use Greek fire, I would take advantage of the fact that I have the much heavier fleet, in terms of much heavier warships, and I would land all my crews well before the battle takes place. And this will hopefully avoid the outbreak of malaria that severely weakened the oarsmen and the crews of the the sort of marines and such on the ships. So then when Octavian's fleet appears, I will have a fully ready fleet. I won't have traitorous defections telling what my battle plans are. I'll have hopefully near enough full strength crews, and I'll have the Egyptian squadron also on side, which already gives me a much stronger position. And then what I will probably do is I will dummy the enemy fleet. So almost in a way of Hannibal, really, I will position my heaviest ships on the wings. I'll put my lighter ships in the middle, but I'll make sure that I'm in the middle in one of the heaviest ships. And I will, because they're all powered, I'll order everybody to fall back, but I'll order the heavier ships to row slightly harder, so it will appear as if my wings are falling back faster, thus leaving me exposed. This should hopefully bait Octavian into going for the jugular, heading for the centre, and when he does that, then I will simply raise the signal flag, everybody reverses course, at which point it's probably too late for him to do anything about it. My centre keeps withdrawing, my two wings accelerate forwards, and therefore my two heavy wings of very heavy warships smash into his. That should probably either pin or crush his wings, trapping him in the centre with me. Theoretically, he has more warships, but I will have erected some safety barriers, some wooden palisades on the upper works of my ships to avoid incoming projectile fire as much as possible, and then I will order the general advance along with the Egyptian squadron, which I will have fallen back on, and my combined squadrons will then punch straight through his middle, isolate him, take the flagship, and between that and the fact my heavy ships are probably wreaking havoc on his wings, should hand me the battle quite comfortably. At which point, as I said, completely different timeline for the Roman Empire, which should be quite entertaining. James Reinlieb asks, long-time viewer, first-time poster, a couple of questions. I've noticed when viewing or reading about ships from different nations that crew complements can vary quite a bit. For instance, when Hood was lost, she had approximately 1,415 men on board, and Prince of Wales, when sunk, had about 1,520, versus Bismarck with over 2,200, and Scharnhorst at 1,968 when they went down. Assuming these figures are correct, and apologies if they aren't, are there any specific reasons why the German ships carried several hundred more men? I'm assuming admirals and their staff should roughly cancel out, and it seems especially surprising given Hood's age, as she required less hands. And secondly, given all the research you've done on all the programs and questions answered, have there been any particular things that you've discovered that have really surprised or amused you? Many thanks. So the main differences in crew size largely, although not entirely, but largely come down to two factors. One is that, especially with Bismarck set sail with a deliberately oversized crew in order to allow for what they thought was going to be a successful merchant raiding operation. So there were enough people on board for prize crews. That's what pushed Bismarck's crew numbers up so dramatically compared to something like Hood. And the other thing is anti-aircraft batteries, and specifically their gun crew sizes. This is an issue that the Americans would find when they covered their ships in AA guns in the Pacific, but turns out actually having a lot of secondary and anti-aircraft guns aboard your ship does increase your crew size quite dramatically. So, for example, the Bismarck, as well as its main turrets, had no less than 14 emplacements of either anti-surface secondary or heavy AA, the 150mm and 105mm guns. And each of those emplacements was a twin mount. So you're talking about 28 either heavy AA or secondary battery gun barrels. That each of those turrets, each of those twin mounts or twin turrets, requires a fair number of crew, and just to man them. And then of course you've got the ammunition handling, magazines, etc., and that's before we get down to the light anti-aircraft 37mm and 20mm guns. So compare that with Hood. At the time of her sinking, Hood, in terms of secondary battery or heavy AA, is carrying 7 twin 4-inch mounts. So the 4-inch gun is slightly smaller anyway, so it's going to, a twin 4-inch mount is going to require fractionally less crew, although not much. But the main thing is it's half as many mounts because you're not splitting secondary and anti-air into two separate things for your medium caliber weaponry. She's then also obviously got various light anti-aircraft guns, the same as every other ship at the time, but that is where the main crew difference, I suspect, is going to come in that sense. And similarly, when you compare Scharnhorst and Prince of Wales, so in terms of heavy, what we classify as a heavy AA or secondary batteries, Scharnhorst carries 6 twin mounts for the 150mm and 7 twin mounts for the 105mm. So she's carrying 13 twin mounts in that kind of caliber, plus all the various lighter anti-aircraft guns, whereas Prince of Wales, because it's carrying a dual-purpose secondary battery, is only carrying 8 twin mounts of the 5.25 inch. So 8 versus 13, okay, the gap's not anywhere near as much as the gap between Hood and Bismarck, but Bismarck obviously had the greater crew numbers anyway. So that's basically what you're talking about. Bismarck's crew overinflated somewhat by the fact they had prize crews aboard and the fact that the Germans went for a separate secondary battery and heavy anti-aircraft battery in 2 separate calibers, as opposed to the Royal Navy practice at the time of having a single caliber, meant that the Royal Navy had individually fewer of those sort of mid-size 4 to 5 to 6 inch caliber weapons on their ships, and the requisite gun crews, ammunition handling parties, magazine crews, etc. were obviously therefore somewhat less. Now, as for surprising discoveries, or interesting ones, I think I could go on all day about this, but I think there would probably be 3 general discoveries that I could say have been surprising or amusing. One of which is just how much the spirit of trolling was alive in the era of the pre-Dreadnought and earlier warships, especially in the Royal Navy. Quite how they managed to keep a straight face on all the various bits and pieces they got up to, I have no idea. And the fact that at the time, despite the fact you are quite literally trolling with your Navy's, at the time, effectively strategic deterrent, the fact that so many people in the UK public and Parliament thought this was an absolutely fantastic thing and usually would vote people thanks or plates of silverware and things like that, basically just for annoying the French usually. So yeah, I mean, I knew it happened, but the degree to which the Royal Navy got up to it was quite an amusing discovery. Secondly, just quite how eclectic the Ironclad era was. I was vaguely aware of it. I knew there had been some weird and wonderful designs, most especially in the American Civil War, and obviously the more famous stuff like HMS Captain. But as you can see in the picture above, the more and more I've looked into it, especially as I've been doing the more in-depth research for the eventual release of the successor to the Sail to Steam video, which will cover from the first Ironclad up to some point in the Iron Era. I haven't decided exactly how far yet. There's no way I'll get all the way up to pre-Dreadnoughts, otherwise I'd be there for 4 hours. But that's partly as a result of just coming across design after design after design and going, okay, I know opium was legal at the time, but you guys must have been smoking something a heck of a lot stronger to come up with some of this stuff. I mean, if you just look at something like the Battle of Lissa, line up pictures of all the Austro-Hungarian ships at the Battle of Lissa and then tell someone, okay, how would you order these ships? And I can't think of anybody without an in-depth knowledge of the period who would say, oh yes, they're clearly all from the same fleet. They'd probably put them in some kind of evolution of man kind of ascendancy, going from primitive all the way up to really modern looking, and a few of them they'd wonder what the heck they were and if they were photoshopped. So yeah, that would be a surprising one for me. And I think the only other one would be the surprising lack of imagination when it came to peacetime colour schemes in the pre-dreadnought era. Because you had all the weird and wacky camouflage schemes. You had the grey, which everybody adopted in the 20th century. But when you see a lot of artwork at the time for things like the Great White Fleet, unsurprisingly, their main colour being white, the Victorian era, late Victorian era Royal Navy with the sort of black hulls, buff funnels, white superstructures, and some of the French stuff, you think, oh, that's quite a contrast of colours. I wonder what everybody else is doing. It's like you're imagining maybe someone's painted their hulls red, someone else has gone green, etc. You look around and actually it seems like white, some vague shade of yellow, orange, and black appear to have been the vast majority of colours that everyone was using, even in peacetime, to show off their ships, which was surprising and a little disappointing to me, I think. I would have preferred a much more colourful fleet. Stafford Magnus asks, could you briefly detail how and when navies transitioned from using smoothbore guns to longer rifled guns of the dreadnought era? Also, was there any particular technological development that spurred the creation of the rifled naval gun? So, it's a little bit of a misnomer to say it went from smoothbore to longer barreled rifled guns. The transition from smoothbore guns followed basically three lines. Obviously, you had the transition to rifled guns, you had the transition to longer guns separately, and you also had the transition to breech loading guns. And they all happened at different rates, and also happened at different rates in different navies. So one of the first actually advances was the breech loader, which had the advantage of not having to run the entire gun back into the into your ship in order to reload it, and also facilitated much faster reloading. So when you look at something like say HMS Warrior in 1860, it's actually equipped with 110-pounder Armstrong breech loading guns, as well as the more traditional smoothbore muzzle loading 68-pounders. Unfortunately, the technology for the breech loader wasn't quite there yet, and there were a number of issues with breeches popping out, breeches exploding, and the seals on the breeches just not being particularly good. So the pressure in the gun was reduced, and that actually meant that from an armor piercing perspective, in terms of energy delivered, the 68-pounder was actually better than the 110-pounder in most cases, unless you could get an actual properly working 110-pounder. So breech loading guns and muzzle loading guns operated alongside each other for a while. Gradually, as guns got larger and larger physically, even if their caliber length didn't get particularly much longer, it became harder and harder to reload them from the muzzle. And so some navies adopted breech loaders much earlier, which allowed them to actually make fairly long smoothbore breech loading guns in terms of absolute length, as opposed to, as I say, a proportional caliber length. But particularly in the Royal Navy, there were a couple of incidents with some rather large breech loading guns, which compounded with some of the early problems with things like the Armstrong 110-pounder, actually made the Royal Navy regress back to muzzle loading. As you can see here, this rifled muzzle loading almost 18-inch 100-ton gun. And that led to some very interesting ships where they would have these monstrous 16-inch plus weaponry. But to reload it, you had to depress the entire gun down into the ship. And because the gun, there was absolutely no way you could run that back into a turret or barbette, there was actually a separate loading mechanism in the forward part of the ship. So you'd wind the gun all the way down so it's depressing down into the ship, and then you'd ram the charge and shot home into the muzzle, almost like a gigantic, well, it was basically a gigantic cannon that wouldn't seem out of place if it was scaled down a bit on a Nelsonian Age of Sail ship. So that was a limitation on the length of the barrel because, well, you couldn't get the barrel too much longer before you start poking over the end of your ship, which makes reloading a lot more problematic, to say the least. What really then, but as you can see here, as with this gun, you can see the rifling had actually come in. So although this was a muzzle loading gun, and although it's a fairly short gun, it's already rifled. And the rifling comes in basically when the manufacturing precision to allow it comes in, and when the power of the gun allows for a range and shell type such that, well, A, you can rifle it because you can't really rifle a cannonball, but a rifled shell where the rifling actually has a meaningful effect on accuracy. So this all pretty much happens between the 1860s and 1880s. There's about a 20-year period where all of this is going on, I say, in different rates at different countries. Once it becomes clear that breech loading is actually the future, then, and breech loading is reliable, then as various nations start to adopt breech loading rifled guns, then with this restriction on the length caused by the need to reload from the muzzle removed, guns can start getting progressively longer and longer. What also helps is a transition away from gunpowder as the charge to more long-burning powders and other types of explosive, because there's no point in making a long barrel if all the explosive expansion of your charge is spent by the time the shell's halfway down. In fact, all that's going to do, if anything, is slow the shell down. So there's this happy period in the 1870s and 1880s where you get a combination of breaches now become properly fully sealed and working across the board in pretty much all major navies. Metallurgy increases to the point that they can actually build gun barrels significantly longer without it drooping and without needing the massive sort of Dahlgren style Coke bottle setup. The rifling's already in place because the range has already got out far enough for it to make a difference. And then with these powders that then allow for a longer barrel to actually have some use, you then suddenly see the deployment of breech loading rifled long barrel guns pretty much happen within the space of a few years. And that's how, one of the ways you can sort of distinguish actually a lot of the immediately pre-dreadnoughts from the pre-dreadnoughts is that all of a sudden you see the much more traditional long barrel naval rifle appear. Mikko Leitinen, I think, please tell me if I got that wrong, asks, which contributed more to the downfall of the Japanese Navy in World War II, the casualties amongst their experienced and well-trained air crews, or the simultaneous rise in quality of American crews, or the Essex span? Separately, what would have happened if the Japanese had won the Battle of the Coral Sea? So, with regards to Coral Sea, you could actually make an argument that, at least at a tactical level, the Japanese actually won the Battle of Coral Sea anyway. The Americans lost a fleet carrier and had another damaged. Yorktown had to withdraw, thereby conceding the field to the Japanese. Obviously, Lexington sank. The Japanese, they had a fleet carrier damaged, but they only actually lost a light carrier and a destroyer and some other warships as well. The US obviously lost an oiler and a destroyer at the same time. So overall, the Japanese actually sank over twice the tonnage of ships, including the Lexington, that the US sank in terms of Japanese tonnage. And the loss of the Lexington reflected a significantly greater loss of US carrier strength in the Pacific, especially with Yorktown having to withdraw as well. Now, you've got to remember the actual objective of the Battle of the Coral Sea was for the Japanese to get an invasion force through to Port Moresby on Papua New Guinea, and that's the bit where the Allies won, because the strategic victory was in the fact that because Task Force 16 with Enterprise and Hornet made a dummy run south, even though they were under orders to basically get spotted by the Japanese so they think you're coming and then run away back to Pearl Harbor, it meant the Japanese thought after the actual Battle of the Coral Sea, they thought they might face another attack from another 2 US fleet carriers, at which point they didn't want to risk that since they were down to sort of 1.5 carriers. from their original sort of 2.5, 2 3/4. So that's why they cancelled the invasion. So in a scenario where you might say they win at the Battle of the Coral Sea would be a case of, well, either they just for whatever reason don't spot the incoming ships of Task Force 16 and continue to press on, or they can decide they're going to press on anyway. At which point you basically have two choices. One is either the Americans let them go and Port Moresby gets attacked. Whether or not Port Moresby falls is probably beyond the scope of this analysis, but assuming it did fall, it would place the Japanese much closer to Australia than anybody would be particularly comfortable with. But on the other hand, it does open a massive extended supply route that the Japanese have to keep open, which would be an ideal attack for lots of American and British forces and their various Commonwealth allies. On the other hand, the other option is that if the Japanese don't break off their invasion just by seeing Task Force 16, they may very well, Task Force 16 might have to be ordered to engage. And bear in mind, Enterprise and Hornet had just come back from the Doolittle raid. So yeah, you might get some form of second battle of the Coral Sea with Enterprise and Hornet's aircraft going after the Japanese. Now, again, that could go two ways, although it's more likely, given that one of the two Japanese fleet carriers is badly damaged and the other one has almost run out of aircraft, and the Japanese didn't believe in cross-platforming quite so much. Enterprise and Hornet's air group should have superiority. So, if the Japanese decide to press on for whatever reason, either because they don't spot Task Force 16 or they decide to ignore it, and the Americans are ordered, right, well, you've got to stop this invasion force attack anyway, that might actually end up with one or both of those carriers sunk outright, which would actually slightly accelerate the Japanese loss of the Pacific theatre. Now, in terms of the other question, what contributed more to the downfall of the Japanese Navy, I'm going to go with the casualties amongst their air crews, because they couldn't replace them fast enough at all, to the point that obviously by the time you get to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the carriers are pretty much just decoys, because they've got the aircraft, they just don't have the pilots anymore. Now, that's not at all to say that the rising quality of American air crews wasn't also an important factor. It was, as was the Essex spam. But if you look at those three potential factors and remove one, let's look at the scenario. So if we remove the loss of experienced and well-trained air crews, let's say the Japanese, for whatever reason, either because they don't take that many losses or they actually have a decent training program, they manage to keep up the numbers of well-trained and experienced air crews. That's a major problem, because basically up until about the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese still have, for the most part, a number of carrier hulls that they can fly aircraft off of. And pretty much until around just after Leyte Gulf, the Essex spam isn't really in full force, which means that the situation would go from the Americans having had a decisive advantage, having broken most of the Japanese carriers' air power earlier. It would mean that every carrier battle, sort of Philippine Sea, Midway, obviously, all the way up to Leyte Gulf, up to and including Leyte Gulf, would be hard fought. The Americans would still probably have advantages, definitely, but they would be taking a lot more losses as well, which is going to overall slow the campaign and thus slow the downfall of the Japanese Navy. It also means if they're having to commit considerably greater resources to taking out the Japanese carriers, because they're still defended by large numbers of decently flown fighters, it means the rest of the Japanese Navy that got attacked by aircraft and sunk obviously is going to be much less of a target. So there's that. Whereas if you look at the other two, if the rising quality of American air crews is taken out of the picture, the fact of the matter is that unlike the Japanese, the Americans still had a good training program that could turn out lots of decent quality pilots, even if they weren't kind of ace experienced flyers. Which means that if, for some bizarre reason, either because their really experienced aircrews get shot down, or get magically, unfortunately, taken out with the loss of a couple of big carriers, or just pulled back for training or whatever, but if you eliminate the ace crews of the Americans, the fact is the baseline of the American Navy's fighter and strike wings are still well trained, and there's still quite a number of them. So again, it would cause the American forces to take slightly more losses, but if they're going up against a much more decreased Imperial Japanese Navy air arm, with sort of the relatively low numbers and low quality of pilots they had toward the end, plus the Essexes coming online in mass numbers, the fact that your own air crews are still there numerically large but just not quite as experienced isn't going to make that much of a difference compared to if your opponents are actually still fielding vast numbers of decent pilots. And then lastly, look at, well, if you remove the Essex spam, then you've still got high quality American crews, low quality and low number Japanese air crews, at which point the fact that you only have sort of a few dozen instead of multiple dozens of hulls, again, doesn't make that much of a difference. If in the end, does it really matter if the aircraft that kill something like the Yamato come off of a dozen Independence class or a handful of fleet carriers? I mean, okay, fair enough. Having fleet carriers around without the Essexes, period, is going to be a bit of a problem, because by about halfway through the war, you're down to basically Enterprise and Saratoga. But if we assume a more sensible thing, which is basically just the US produces Essex class, just not in the stupidly vast numbers, well, slightly less overwhelming firepower. I mean, that's in that scenario where you've got slightly fewer Essexes but still reduced Japanese crews and experienced American crews. It's basically like saying, well, here is a walnut. Now, if I hit it with this 6-pound forge hammer, it will be slightly less smashed than if I hit it with this 12-pound sledgehammer. Technically true. The walnut's probably not going to know much of the difference. So yeah, of the three, probably the single largest contributory factor was the loss and lack of ability to replace of the experienced Japanese air crews. But that's not to say that any of the other factors weren't important, because they most definitely were. David Blanchard asks, what are your top 5 movies for depicting naval service during the Second World War? Well, at the risk of sounding somewhat repetitive, as these kind of movies will probably be familiar to an awful lot of you, I think if I was going to take from some of the better known ones, I'd say The Cruel Sea, shown here at the moment, The Battle of the River Plate, apart from rather interesting choices as to who was portraying what ship-wise, it's a very good film Navy-wise in terms of naval service. You said Navy service as opposed to combat. And then, of course, you have Tora Tora Tora, an infinitely better version of the Pearl Harbor attacks than, yes, Michael Bay's explosions and everything everywhere. Das Boot, of course, seminal work when it comes to submarines, and the less said about the other U-boat film more recently, the better. And then finally, you're going to have to sink the Bismarck in as well. All of these are very good examples of naval service. Obviously, depending on the era, depending on the level of budget, etc., their depictions of naval combat can range from convincing to, yes, that's an airfix kit, to I'm pretty sure the Graf Spee is somehow growing an extra turret, but that wasn't the question. The question was, what about the naval service? And I think those stand pretty well head and shoulders above most other films, although there are a number of strong contenders. If you want to put together a top 10, I could quite happily reel off another 5. Mason Asher Stewart asks, how effective do you think the naval bombardment actually was during the invasion of Normandy, and more specifically post-D-Day, such as British battleships reportedly shredding parts of the 12th SS Division defending Caen? It's one that's been argued both ways, really. The simple fact of the matter is that in terms of direct fire support on the D-Day landings themselves, the battleships didn't tend to take part in direct support of the beaches so much. That was mostly left to cruisers and destroyers, so to a certain degree you could argue, well, the battleships weren't that useful. On the other hand, the battleships were engaging the heavyweight German coastal defences. Now, you could argue that, well, the heavyweight German coastal defences and the battleships kind of tied each other up and neutralised each other, so it's a bit of a wash. But you've got to remember that had the battleships not been there, then the task of fighting those batteries would either have fallen to cruisers who were, or destroyers that either wouldn't have been able to engage them or would have been far more vulnerable to near misses and hits, and would have taken them away from being able to support the beaches, or alternatively, if the cruisers and destroyers had stayed fighting on to support the beaches, then those heavy guns would have had open season to take out those ships and other landing craft, which would have dramatically increased the casualties. So I think for the actual invasion, the battleships were very useful, but they were very useful in neutralising a portion of the enemy's defences more so than actual direct fire support on the beaches themselves. Although one does have to wonder just how spectacularly effective, if they could get the sort of danger close parts of aiming right, it would have been if you just salvoed 9 16-inch shells straight into the German bunkers overlooking Omaha Beach, because I rather suspect that would have put an end to resistance rather quickly. But I think the risk of being a fraction off and taking a good chunk out of your own invasion force is probably why they didn't use them in direct fire support roles. Now, when it comes to the rest, say in bombardment around Caen and everything, again, accounts differ dramatically. Some accounts, both on the German and Allied side, speak of the battleship guns being very effective. Other accounts say that they weren't, which is further confused by reports of various battleship fire support missions throwing Tiger tanks all around the place, despite the fact there actually weren't that many, if any, Tiger tanks present in the immediate vicinity around the Normandy landings. Apparently, most Allied crews thought everything that was Panzer IV shaped was a Tiger, which you can understand to a certain degree, given the stresses of combat and all that. But anyway, overall, on the balance of various sources I've read, whilst some of the more exaggerated and overblown stuff, like taking out 50 Tigers or whatever, is definitely not real, at least for the initial part, until the advance moved inland beyond the range of the guns, if nothing else, the accounts of the Allied soldiers that I've read seem to indicate that they greatly appreciated it, and as we all know, morale is a huge part of an army's effectiveness, and the morale of the various Allied soldiers was definitely massively improved by having these huge guns on call, to the point that, in an account about HMS Rodney's part in the bombardment missions, one British infantry officer wrote that basically the men got a huge boost not out of the fact of necessarily taking out specific Germans, but just at night, every so often, they'd radio in and request fire support on somewhere where they reckon the Germans might be hiding, at which point there'd be a crack and a flash offshore, and then all of a sudden colossal explosions as several tons of high explosive were detonating ahead of them, which can't have been a nice thing for the Germans to experience if they were anywhere nearby, but definitely cheered the British soldiers up a fair bit. And obviously there were definitive battleship fire support missions that did wipe out defences that would have been otherwise very hard to dig out. So yeah, I'd say overall, on the pendulum of various historians who swing between useless and absolutely vital, I would say I'm probably in the 70 to 80% range of they were very useful. They definitely had a valid military effect, and they certainly accomplished things that probably most other forms of fire support couldn't. and they definitely had a huge effect on Allied morale, at least in the areas where the bombardment was available, which cannot be discounted. But at the same time, you shouldn't believe everything you read about those particular fire support missions, because there is a few sort of blatant lies and over-exaggerations out there. David Toyne says, something I haven't noticed is the use of muzzle brakes on capital ship guns to reduce recoil. Is it a technology that came too late, or a case of backblast on large guns causing more potential damage than the recoil would in the first place? I have covered this in a previous Drydock, so I'll only cover it briefly here, but basically it's much more of the latter than the former. As you can see from this picture of a much more modern artillery piece, the main problem with muzzle brakes when it comes to naval artillery is that the blast still has to go somewhere. And if you have a multiple barrel turret and you fit it with muzzle brakes like was fitted on this particular artillery piece, that is basically going to reduce your accuracy to below Littorio levels. It's probably going to reduce your accuracy to below Battle of Manila Bay levels, because that amount of exhaust gas, assuming it doesn't just smash the shells into each other, or do something equally horrific, is going to throw the pattern of the shells off so dramatically you might as well be firing a shotgun down the range for all the accuracy you're going to get out of it. So yeah, horizontal muzzle brake, no. And if you turn the muzzle brake 90 degrees, well, yeah, then you've got the problem of the blast of most, certainly battleship level guns, was already capable of doing serious damage to anything left exposed and out in the open. I mean, just look at the introduction for the 5-minute guides to see the cloud of debris from something that was left around when those guns were fired. I think it's towards the end of that 30-second segment. And if someone comes up to you and says, yes, I have an idea, I will put muzzle brake on, and muzzle brake will direct the blast closer in and more directed towards us, and also it will be pointing down, so that in certain circumstances it will be pointing straight at our deck. The response of the Admiral to whom this idea is presented is probably to figure out some way to break enough bones in that person's body to stuff them into said gun and blast them as far away from their ship as humanly possible. Yeah, let's say about 30 to 40% of the muzzle blast energy of a 16-inch 50 caliber gun being directed about 15 to 20 feet straight down into an Iowa's deck. There are more interesting ways of committing suicide on a battleship, but that is one of the more inventive ones. So yes, that's basically the answer to your question. Yeah, you do not want the muzzle blast of a 15 or 16-inch, or even on a Yamato an 18-inch naval rifle, anywhere closer to your ship than it already is. Admiral Tiberius asks, if the Allied cruiser force had been alert and ready off Guadalcanal instead of being ambushed, how could that have changed the war in the South Pacific? I'm going to take a guess and assume that you're talking about the first battle of Savo Island, considering that seems to match most of the criteria in your question. There's still a fair opportunity that the Allies will lose ships. I mean, a number of the ships that were lost to torpedo hits, and those long lances are at that point were still relatively underappreciated in terms of their lethality. But on the other hand, if they're a little bit more on the ball with the gunfire, they'll probably inflict somewhat heavier losses on the Japanese. To be perfectly honest, the Japanese kind of bottled it with their victory. They withdrew anyway. They had a chance to seriously mess with the Allied plan for the area by attacking the Allied troop transports, which they were then capable of doing, but they didn't. And although it slowed things down, I don't think an Allied victory there is going to massively change the war in the South Pacific. The single biggest effect is probably just going to be the significant amounts of supplies and reinforcements, etc., will be sent through to Guadalcanal much sooner than they were without having to have that sort of thin lifeline that was there for a few months after First Savo Island. So the Guadalcanal campaign probably gets wrapped up a few months earlier, at which point Japan loses slightly harder, just a little bit sooner, because the Allies can move on to other things. Possibly the only long-term butterfly might be that if say the Guadalcanal campaign is shortened by a significant amount, say 3 or 4 months, given how advanced Allied preparations were for Operation Olympic and Operation Downfall, given that a victory at First Savo Island isn't going to affect how quickly the atomic bomb is developed, it's possible that the Allies might actually begin some form of landing on or very near the Japanese home islands, which could actually end up increasing Allied casualties. It just depends on whether or not they're willing to call a fairly lengthy pause to get the atomic bomb in operation. Adoni J. Benyares, I think again, says, given the naval surface assets the Germans had in World War II, how could they have used them better, and how big a difference could they have made? Well, given that we're going by the historical assets they had in World War II itself, I can't go with my normal favourite answer, which is refit the Scharnhorsts, because that would take too long by the time the war's actually broken out. So, in terms of making more efficient use of what they actually have, better use, certainly a lot better planning around the Norway campaign. The Germans took some ridiculous losses in the Norway campaign, especially proportional to the overall strength of the Kriegsmarine. So yeah, definitely some better planning there. I mean, the loss of the Blücher was a huge failure of intelligence, and that's probably one of the key ones. I mean, pulling the destroyers out of Narvik sooner to avoid them getting war-spited probably would have helped as well, because that was a good portion of Germany's modern destroyer force that's gone. The loss of some of the Königsberg-class cruisers is less of a problem, because they didn't really do all that much anyway in the Second World War, mainly due to the limitations of the class. As a period, but yeah, I think probably from the Norway campaign, definitely if they got a bit better intel, so they didn't lose Blücher, and pull the destroyers out of, at least what destroyers they can out of Narvik, that in turn might allow them to actually have an escort for Scharnhorst and Gneisenau when they go after Glorious. That's not going to kill Glorious any faster, but it might allow them to not get torpedoed by a Castor and Ardent, which put a massive crimp in the Germans' plans for naval operations thereafter. So, assuming that that part is done better, you then have more destroyers. You have Scharnhorst and Gneisenau in theory available and operational, probably, and you have another Hipper-class heavy cruiser. Now, with all of that, you have a considerably more powerful surface force ready to go. Now, I know people always go on about, whoa, what if we put Bismarck and Tirpitz and Scharnhorst and Gneisenau and sent them all out at once as kind of like an uber-sized Operation Rheinebogen, and at this point you're probably thinking, we'd stick Hipper, Prinz Eugen and Blücher in there as well. And yes, in theory they could have done that. But what people forget about that is that A, that concentration of force takes more time, B, that concentration of force would be spotted. Remember, the enemy is going to react to what you're doing, and if that concentration of force is spotted, the Royal Navy is going to counter with an even bigger concentration of force, and ultimately the Royal Navy has more force to counter with than even that combined force. I mean, it would be a spectacular battle, and it would probably be the one of if not the kind of central discussion point of World War II, sort of almost a mini Jutland 2. But you put that kind of level of force out there, and the Royal Navy is going to be forced to come in with the hammer. And at that point, you've just probably thrown away basically your entire surface capital ship deterrent force, even if you take out a number of British capital ships or badly damage them. The fact is the British can rebuild that, and Germany can't, which actually ends up giving the British far more free hand in operation in the rest of the theatres of war, and especially if you do this in Operation Rheinebung period 1941, that means actually that's releasing a number of modern capital ships that might survive that particular battle to go and annoy the Italians, which I'm sure they'll thank you for. So yes, I wouldn't do that, but by having, what I probably would do is I would probably send out the 3 Hippers together as a raiding squadron, because they're fast enough to get away from pretty much anything apart from Hood and Renown and Repulse, and the British have better things to do with those, because heavy cruisers, much less of a threat than battleships. So yeah, send the 3 Hippers out together. Don't keep them together once they get into the Atlantic. They can split up, but then sort of split up, meet back at Brest at so and so date. That would cause a fair bit of havoc. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had a fairly good run of things, but then you've got the whole Channel Dash thing. But the thing is, heavy cruisers are a lot more easy to repair. You can find a lot more places for them to dock, and ultimately speaking, if you want to look at the cold hard facts of things, you can lose them a little bit more easily than you could take losing Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. I keep Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, Bismarck and Tirpitz around, back, probably along with the Panzerschiff. Because it's very, very soon there's going to be, at that point, a war with Russia, and then if you move that force, so what's that? That's Admiral Scheer, Lutzow, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, Bismarck, Tirpitz, and any of the Hippers that survived the Atlantic raiding operations. If you move that lot up to Norway, and you think about this ahead of time and make sure you've built up decent oil stockpiles, that's going to put a huge crimp in the Allied ability to supply the Russians. Because it's one thing if you've got Tirpitz or Scharnhorst. Yeah, sure, the Allies can shake loose a couple of battleships, maybe a carrier or two, and some cruisers to escort and guard against that kind of stuff. But when your potential threat is 4 battleships and 2 Panzerschiff, that's an awful lot of force that has got to be kept on tap. And as we saw with Bismarck, with Tirpitz and the various fleet air arm efforts to dislodge it and damage it, you would be able to protect the anchorage fairly well against people trying to take you out at anchor. So I think that those would be the main things. Would be do the Norwegian campaign better and cause massive problems by concentrating a large force against the Norwegian convoys. Even if you don't launch that many missions against them, just the threat will be enough to do an awful lot of damage and cost an awful lot of money, and that will massively limit Allied naval options and possibly even throttle the supplies to Russia. It's not going to win the war, but it will certainly make a fair bit of a difference, and it'll probably drag it out by a fair bit. And you've always got the opportunity, if you want, to send them all out at once into one glorious battle up in the raging ice storms of the Arctic Ocean. Now, I know we're coming up to the 1 hour mark, but thanks to the experimental format of the dry docks in the past month, I think we can probably get away with an extended dry dock to clear these questions. So I'm going to press on and see how it goes. Wienwe asks, supposing there had been a hot war instead of a cold one between NATO and the Warsaw Pact in the 1980s, how would you compare the later hypothetical Battle of the Atlantic to the actual one in World War II? Would a naval war have been much shorter? I'm assuming there would have been reforger-type convoys, but how many of these would have been even plausible, considering NATO countries had significantly smaller merchant marines than the Allies had in the 1940s? Would it have made a difference if we changed the starting point of this hypothetical war? Would either side have had the upper hand if we assume this war took place in the 50s, 60s, or 70s? So, as I've said before, I don't like touching the more modern subjects, in particular because of the politics, and it's a bit too close to current period. Also, my expertise in the more modern stuff, because a lot of it is obviously still classified and hotly debated, is less. But As a brief thing, I'd say ultimately there's an awful lot of propaganda thrown around by both sides about the respective capabilities of each navy in the Cold War, and a lot of that partly because a lot of the systems are still in operation, and partly because even when they're not, a lot of the people who are involved are still around. A lot of that hasn't gone away. So if you listen to one set of sources, then everything would have ended horribly with mass numbers of Soviet submarines and homing torpedoes and incoming supersonic cruise missiles the size of small buses everywhere, and everything would have been on fire and screaming. If you listen to another set of sources, it would have been a case of various NATO anti-submarine warfare units cackling madly as they drop torpedo after torpedo into the water on the incredibly noisy Russian submarines, and the various bombers and such would be intercepted by F-14 Tomcats and SM-1 and SM-2 missiles. So the truth is probably somewhere in between, especially coupled with the fact that after the Cold War, the one thing I'm quite happy to say is that after the Cold War, when the NATO countries got a good look at Soviet equipment, they discovered that a fair bit of it was significantly more capable than they'd otherwise thought. Which, I mean, both scenarios where it's a total wipeout for one side or the other are quite obviously ridiculous. Both sides were peer opponents, and you don't get to be peer opponents without that. If one side has just such a ridiculous decisive advantage over the other, kind of obviates the term. But with all that said, it's definitely going to be a lot shorter, in part because there's just a lot fewer warships involved. And they can't be replaced anywhere near as quickly. If an Arleigh Burke or a Kidd or a FFG-7 gets blown up or sunk, it's going to take a while to replace that. It's going to take a lot longer to replace it than, say, an Atlanta class or a Fletcher class or a Tribal or something like that. In World War II, you could lose ships like that, or destroyer escorts especially, and sloops and corvettes. You could lose that, and you could have a replacement drawn out of another part of the operational theatre or built in the same year. At least in terms of built coming off the slipways, I mean. It would have had to start build earlier. But anyway, the general point is you're not going to replace losses anywhere near as quickly, so you're going to run out of one side or the other is going to run out of ships and submarines and aircraft to an effective extent much faster than the actual real World War II Battle of the Atlantic. I rather suspect that given the way well, say quote unquote modern weapons, guided weapons and such worked and still work, it would probably come down to one or two decisive actions. If there's big reforger convoy type operations, the Russians would have to go for those, and everything would tilt on those kind of operations. Because both sides would be committing fairly significant numbers of assets to them, if something goes horribly wrong or horribly right, depending on which side you're on, and a major defeat - major victory is achieved in that kind of environment, that and possibly one or two more engagements like it will probably tip the entire balance completely, because the losses on one side or the other would be so heavy as to either prevent them or strongly discourage them from ever trying anything like that again. Now, obviously, if the Russians manage to send most of a reforger convoy and its escorts, including nuclear carriers, to the bottom, that's a huge body blow. It cuts off supply lines and reinforcements to the Allies in Europe, and blows a massive hole in their ability to stop the Russians from doing the same thing to other convoys and ships. Conversely, if the escort works and the Russian long-range strategic bombers and attack submarines are ground down to a bloody pulp before managing to take out many, if any, of the transports, then the Russian ability to interdict any kind of significant convoy effort is going to be very badly restricted, if not outright taken out for the rest of the war, which opens up the supply lines and make things a lot easier for a given value of easy in a conventional World War III. But there you go. So yes, I think that's probably about as far as I'd be prepared to take my analysis. So Long John asks, would Operation Catherine have had any hope of success if the Royal Navy had decided to go through with it? So for those of you who aren't aware, this is Churchill's plan to increase the beam of of 3 R-class battleships to 140 feet by adding monstrous bulges, covering the thing in anti-aircraft guns, and basically turning it into some form of modern-day turtle ship and using it to attack the Baltic, in the theory that between the anti-aircraft guns and the increased deck armour and the bulges, it's pretty much immune to anything the Germans can throw at it. So, would it have had any hope of success? If the entirety of the Luftwaffe was drunk, asleep, or high, preferably all three, and pretty much the same for the Kriegsmarine. Yeah. The main problem with Operation Catherine is that, yes, Churchill, I can see what you mean by, if we send battleships into the Baltic, they're going to die. This is correct. The solution is not then, let's slap a bunch of what is effectively extra ablative armour on them. You're not addressing the problem, which is that there's going to be vast numbers of torpedoes and bombs falling and shooting through the water at you. And no matter what practical amount of bulges and deck armour you can put on, the Germans are going to have more torpedoes and bombs to throw at you, especially given the speed that these things would have been going at. Yeah, it's realistically, no. It was never going to work. If they made a kind of a feint with the 3 converted R-class just to see what would happen, they could probably make it a surprising way towards the Baltic before being sunk, or possibly a slightly less long distance before turning around and coming back with an implausible number of bombs and torpedoes having hit them. But outside of a way of proving a point, whatever that point might actually be, it's a non-starter from the beginning. The way you deal with the fact that you face death from endless rains of bombs and torpedoes is to take out the aircraft and suppress the submarines first, not send in a giant floating pinata saying, shoot me here. Now, Stafford Magnus asks, how were naval guns stabilised, when did it start, and how did it evolve over time? Alright, well there's 2 main ways of doing this. On lighter guns, sort of anti-aircraft guns and such like, you stabilise the gun itself. So you'll have seen similar kind of technology when it comes to things like professional camera rigs when they're out filming, tank gun stabilization systems, etc. They're all effectively the same thing. You stabilize the gun so it stays in place despite the fact that everything around it is moving. However, when you look into what kind of weight of machinery you'd need to stabilize an entire triple 16-inch turret, yeah, that starts to get implausibly big. Also requires implausibly strong materials. So that basically doesn't happen when it comes to the main caliber guns of, well, cruisers and battleships and even some of their secondaries. So the way that they are stabilized, quote unquote, starts around the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century with the introduction of the gyro stabilization system. This doesn't actually stabilize the guns themselves. What it does is with the gyro it creates a fixed stable point that can be measured, and then you point the guns towards your target using your fire control computer, which is a new thing at the time, around the time of HMS Dreadnought. So you point your guns towards where, if your ship is straight and level in all 3 dimensions, then if you fire your guns at that point, the shell should in theory land at the target. And then what happens is with the gyro, you can give it a certain margin of error if you like, but the gyro, you sort of press your firing button, and as the gyro compares where it is, being perfectly nice and level and stable, compared to where the ship is, as the two begin to match up, then the gyro can complete the circuit and fire the guns. So obviously with the ship pitching and rolling and everything, you'd align your guns, get ready to go, and then you'd hit right, say, okay, fire, and in the next second or two, the ship would come to a level bearing, even if it's only briefly, and then the guns would fire. So that's how you stabilise, quote unquote, big naval guns. So it starts around the early end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, greatly helped by the fire control computer, development of that, albeit it's a mechanical device, obviously at the start, and the main way it evolves is more and more accurate gyros and fire control computers, basically. No one ever quite cracked how to put an entire triple 16-inch turret on a gimbal rig, unfortunately, as amusing as that might be. Coos Army 0001 asks, if HMS Glowworm under Gerard Roope had faced off against USS Johnston under Ernest Evans, who would have won? And would this battle have been in any way affected by the arrival of the Erzherzog Ferdinand Max under Wilhelm von Tegetthoff? Well, as verses go, that's certainly a unique and amusing one to think of. Right, so, well, on paper at least, the Johnston has a significant firepower advantage over the Glowworm. So it's got that going for it. And let's face it, also given how early Glowworm was sunk in the war, Johnston's going to have superior fire control equipment. So overall, I'd give it to the USS Johnston, with the sole exception, with the sole sort of caveat to that of the fact that, well, Glowworm almost got to Admiral Hipper, and Hipper was a heavy cruiser, and for all the fact that Johnston pretty much is a battleship that's shrunk in the wash, the firepower of its 5-inch shells might not quite be enough to stop Glowworm if Glowworm decides to ram. So, yes, as implausible as it might sound, in a normal firefight, I'd give it to the Johnston any day of the week. But if you're putting these particular two up against each other, then there's every opportunity that you can actually believe it that Glowworm can last long enough to pull off a successful ram attack, which would be utterly hilarious. Would it be affected in any way by the Ferdinand Max? Yeah, both sides would probably get distracted and start laughing as to why the heck an ancient ironclad has shown up in the middle of it all. Although, of course, given the utter craziness of this particular scenario, I'm just going to go with Glowworm Glowworm rams the Johnston. The Johnston refuses to sink or break in half, so they're now stuck together, and in the middle of a old school boarding action with cutlasses and pistols at dawn, the Ferdinand Max comes tearing out of a fog bank and just runs both of them down because it can. At which point a rather bemused Admiral Tegetthoff asks the rest of his bridge crew if they felt something. Lewis Maskell asks, who, in your opinion, is the least appreciated naval power between 1500 and the year 2000? Also, might you consider doing a monthly special on some of the more important people in naval matters? Mini biopics on people are definitely something I have planned for the specials. The main problem, to be perfectly honest, with saying it's going to be done every month or whatever, is that, well, we already have the patrons able to vote on one of the special videos per month. We also have the deep dive videos, which are basically effectively another special, so that's 2 a month, and on a typical 4-week month that leaves me with only 2 weeks in which to do things like not catch up, but follow on videos from previous videos, so like the destroyer development videos, development of warships, like the follow-up to the sail to steam video, etc., plus any and all special features that I might want to throw in, battle sort of videos on battles, extended video reviews on certain ships, the live tours of various ships that I might want to do. There's actually not that I've only got 2 slots per month to actually do that in. So to occupy one of those, with a permanent, today is this feature on this particular person, especially when a lot of those people can be very contentious because they're either eulogized or demonized, usually beyond what's sensible, unless they're relatively unknown to the wider populace. I don't think I could do that exactly. As I say, I will do some. I just can't do them every month. Certainly not at this rate, unless I lose the day job or something, and then I've got nothing better to do all week. And please don't let that happen. I actually quite enjoy my day job, and also I need to pay bills. Now, as far as least appreciated naval power, there's a whole slew of them that I could point out. I mean, in Western circles, you don't hear a lot about navies outside of, well, the European theatre. So things like, say, the Korean turtle ships, although they're slightly better known than most, don't get much appreciation outside of niche circles. Coming back in, there's all sorts of things. So, like, I quite often point out that things like the Royal Australian Navy and the Royal Canadian Navies are very underappreciated when it comes to the 20th century, because the Canadian Navy numerically was absolutely colossal by the end of World War II, and the Australian Navy fought like flipping Tasmanian devils against pretty much all comers. And a lot of the time, well, what would you really hear about them unless you're from one of those countries? People usually think of World War One or as the Royal Navy versus the High Seas Fleet, with occasional input, occasionally sort of guest appearances by the US Navy and possibly the French or Austro-Hungarian navies. And they think of World War II generally as the Royal Navy and the US Navy versus the Italian Navy, the Kriegsmarine, and the Imperial Japanese Navy. So, yeah, those would be amongst my candidates for least appreciated naval powers in that period. The further back you go, there's more and more stuff. I mean, like Denmark, of all places, you might say, but Denmark was considered an important enough naval power that when it looked like they might even begin to be thinking about siding with Napoleon, it justified the British sending in a massive fleet to capture, destroy, or otherwise neutralise the Danish fleet twice. So for a country that's mostly known for butter and bacon, in Britain at least these days, it's a very underappreciated naval power in that respect. But in terms of overall, how should I put it? In terms of overall actual power, as opposed to power that people when you compare it to the way that people generally tend to think of him, I'm probably going to have to go with the Dutch Navy, and that's actually nothing to do, bizarrely enough, with the fact that I'm going to the Netherlands in a week and a bit. It genuinely is the fact that for a lot of the Western world, naval history in terms of gun-armed ships kind of goes Spanish Armada, Battle of Lepanto, Anglo-French Wars, something, Napoleonic Wars, Ironclad era, 20th century. And they kind of miss out this whole section where kind of like the Dutch Navy was contending and at points winning the title of top naval dog for significant sections of a rather important piece of Western European history. And then you have the various Anglo-Dutch wars, which are anything between 3 and 7, depending on how you count them. So, yeah, in terms of amount of power they actually wielded versus how much they're known in common culture globally, I'd have to go with the Dutch Navy. Christopher Dent asks, what was the most powerful freshwater, designed, built and operated on freshwater, not ocean-going ship sailed up a river, naval force ever assembled? Well, ironically enough, given the subject of the Wednesday video that immediately precedes this dry dock, it would have to be the Provincial Marine on Lake Ontario in the War of 1812. And I say that because they had a full-on ship of the line. Now, obviously, you can argue later stuff like steam gunboats and stuff will be more powerful than a ship of the line, but proportionally speaking, that's pretty much it. I mean, if the war dragged on into 1815, well, it probably still would have been the Provincial Marine because they would have had 3 ships of the line at that point, and the Americans would have had 2 plus borderline, another ship of the line. But yeah, at the conclusion of 1814 on Lake Ontario, the Royal Navy, or the Provincial Marine, had the equivalent of what, if we're sort of referencing via sort of World War I, World War II standards, a full-on dreadnought battleship and 2 heavy cruisers on a lake, a freshwater lake. That is by far and away the most powerful naval force I think anyone's ever assembled on a lake. Partially by dint of the fact no one's been crazy enough to build a freshwater battleship since. So yeah, that's actually a fairly easy answer, I would think. Townsend Morley asks, would 2 or 3 Des Moines class cruisers have a chance of winning an engagement against a battleship like the Yamato? Theoretically, yes. I mean, a Yamato's broadside would obliterate a Des Moines if it actually scored a hit, but with the sheer rate of fire that the Des Moines 8-inch guns can put out, if there's 3 of them and they get the jump on the Yamato, especially with sort of radar range finding and their late war fire control systems, if they can drop enough high explosive, as long as they're smart enough to carry the high explosive, if they can drop enough high explosive 8-inch shells on the Yamato fast enough to basically smash every single spotting system the ship possesses and every single bit of armament outside of the main turrets, then sure, they can pull off a victory, because at that point the only thing the Yamato has to aim and fire with is the turrets. Now, fair enough, the 8-inch shells aren't high explosive shells aren't going to particularly hurt them, but if everything else is set on fire and exploding and burning, well, one, there's a chance the fires might spread to a magazine, but even if that's not the case, Yamato can't effectively fire back unless the Des Moines close in to close range, which they probably would have to do to actually sink the blasted thing, since they don't have any torpedoes. But if the entire ship is on fire, the limitations on what the Yamato's guns could do under manual control from within the turrets, those limits are probably fairly substantial, at which point the Des Moines might get close enough to just start pumping shells in at the waterline, ideally in the unarmoured bits, but basically put it down death by 1,000 cuts. They could definitely, I think basically, yeah, 3 Des Moines, if they get the drop, they can definitely win an engagement with the Yamato. Whether or not they can sink it, another matter. It's probably one of the few times the US would actually regret not fitting torpedoes to their cruisers. But who knows, super heavy 8-inch shells point blank range might pull off some form of miracle. But it is going to depend, as I say, on getting that drop and getting the hits in quickly, because if Yamato turns around and starts blasting away with the 18-inch shells, I don't really fancy the lifespan of any unfortunate ship that gets stuck in the path of those. Ally Arthur asks, is there any ship that's managed to fire on itself with its own guns? Well, it's generally pretty difficult to do, funnily enough. But outside of, well, a lot of Age of Sail ships technically were damaged by their own guns when they exploded, but that's probably cheating. Off the top of my head, the two most obvious examples I can think of is uh, one of the modern US fast battleships. I believe one of the 5-inch 38 turrets fired into another 5-inch 38 turret by accident, after which they had to put in a kind of guide rail system to stop that happening again. I remember coming across that while doing some research for one of the videos. And during the Sino-Japanese wars at the end of the 19th century, um, although um, it's not quite shooting itself. They didn't actually hit itself with its own shells, but there are some stories that say one of the Chinese ships managed to wipe out its own bridge with a blast from its own guns, and similarly in the Baltic in 1919, a Russian destroyer ostensibly managed to cause severe damage to itself by firing one of its guns too close to the centre line while pointing backwards and taking out the bridge and the chart house. And lastly, Mark Miller asks, I've read that Japanese carriers in World War II never had catapults installed because they could not create a workable design. Could you give a brief overview of the issues and why the US and British did not seem to have the same problems? Now, to be fair, the Japanese did have catapults. Okay, fair enough, they'd kind of borrowed the design from the Germans, but they did have them, and they installed them on submarines and cruisers and the like. So, what they didn't have was a catapult system of a size and rapid reusability suitable for aircraft carriers. They had the opportunity to develop one, but they didn't. And the reason that they didn't, at least from what I've been able to find, appears to be the fact that most of their aircraft were surprisingly good at low speeds, and therefore they didn't have that many problems in the 1930s with ships like Akagi and eventually the Shokakus, with these sort of kind of good low-speed performance aircraft actually taking off. So they didn't see the need of adding extra weight both to the aircraft to survive the shock of acceleration and to the carriers in terms of the catapult systems themselves in order to facilitate a feature they didn't actually think they required. Obviously, this came back to bite them because then, by not focusing on actually developing a working system, it meant that as they started to get higher and higher performance aircraft, and they also started to get fewer and fewer large carrier decks from which to fly them, they were left in a bit of a quandary of they then needed to crash develop aircraft catapults, and they for carriers, and they didn't really manage to pull that off until it was far, far, far too late. Taiho, for example, was supposed to have catapults, but didn't get them because they hadn't worked one out yet. You've got to remember at the time that most of the catapults used were either explosive or hydraulic. Now, explosive catapults are not a good idea for use on carriers repeatedly because, well, it uses an explosive charge. It's very violent and doesn't do the aircraft any favours, but more to the point, well, it's like firing a gun. You create a lot of heat, and when you're launching multiple aircraft, if you're having to catapult fighter after fighter after bomber, you're going to heat up and destroy your catapult very quickly if you're using explosives. I mean, to be honest, the kind of rapid expansion of anything is going to generate heat, but explosives is a very, very good way of generating heat. The hydraulic systems basically comes down to they could get a hydraulic catapult to work. The difference between that and a working concept for a carrier is how quickly can you recharge it, how much force can you put into it, and how much stress can it take repeatedly. Because if you're talking about something like something the size of a cruiser that's catapulting off the odd seaplane or something, yeah, you can just do that. The seaplane's relatively lightweight, all things considered. You only have to do it once, then you've got all the time in the world to reset and figure out any maintenance you need to do. Whereas if you're launching something much heavier, like, say, a torpedo bomber, well, you need something that's a lot more powerful. That's going to put a lot more stress on the system, so your system has to be stronger. You've then got to work out a way of very rapidly emptying it out and recharging it in terms of gathering the power again without losing vast amounts of hydraulic fluid or whatever it is you're using as the liquid part of the mechanism. And on top of all that, you've got to figure out a way of making a system that isn't going to explode on you through repeated stress very, very quickly. And these are the kind of trial and error things that take a while to develop, and for a variety of reasons, partly due to having some small slow carriers around, and partly due to actually some of their aircraft not being all that brilliant at low speed takeoffs. The US Navy and the Royal Navy were a bit ahead of the ball on that one. I mean, to be fair, the first hydraulic catapult system didn't come in until the 1930s on a full-fledged fleet carrier, mid-30s, but yeah, the aircraft carrier was very much an emergent technology, and with something like that, the needs-based drive of the US and Royal Navies was enough to get those things in service a lot quicker and a lot faster than the Japanese, who didn't think they needed them for a while, and then when they did need them, they developed them, but it was too late by the time they managed it. And that brings us to the end of this extended version of the Drydock Patreon edition. Fortunately, we only ran about an hour and a half thanks to the new system, so I think I'm going to keep the Drydock system the way it is going forward. So that's 20 minutes for questions from each of the videos from that, however far back the Drydock is at that point. So that's the Wednesday special and the 5-minute guide. Get 20 minutes for each questions from each of those, and then 20 minutes of Patreon questions, and then the random live streams I've started doing will cover, hopefully, cover Discord questions and any other random bits and pieces I want to bring up. So hopefully there's that, and who knows, with being able to sort of meet and greet people at various events now, perhaps if this becomes a semi-regular thing, I might also do sort of live dry docks with questions from the audience and selected questions from elsewhere. So yeah, I think that all works. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again in another video.